I want people to be able to hear me. It's one thing that I have a hard time with is hearing people. In my life, I listened to a lot of rock and roll music and drove farm equipment, and consequently I have hearing aids now. And so I want to be able to make sure everybody can hear me. Tonight, my presentation is on Before the White Man. And I kind of laugh because I've caught a little heck for using the words white man for this presentation, and I'm just like, why do you worry about things like that? You know, stop making it about yourself, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to discuss who was here before the Europeans came to California and what happened to them. And it is a rather tragic story. Now, the thing is that finding information about the local tribes is very difficult. And over the years, I've been able to acquire, through my travels throughout the western United States, I find books on Central California in bookstores like in Reno, Nevada, or Washington State, and nobody wants to buy a book in California, and I'm thrilled to get them. And this is a very interesting book. It's on the Tachi Yokuts, which is the actual tribe that lives south of Lemoore, and their history. And it was written in the 1960s by Marjorie Cummins. I've drawn some information from this for tonight's show. I also, another book, Handbook of the Yokuts Indians, and that's just done by Frank Latta. This is a very difficult book to find. I was very happy to find it somewhere out of state. I don't remember now, and it's part of my collection. Another book is Handbook of the Indians of California. And probably another sad book is The Destruction of the California Indians, which is also what we're going to talk about today. And the last book I used was Vanishing Landscapes, Land and Life in the Tulare Lake Basin by William Preston. And so these are all books that talk about the area here, and they have a lot of really good detail regarding what happened before the Europeans arrived. In my backyard, I have these little Indian bulls that were found by my father and my uncle, who was sitting over there, on the ranch that's out here north of Hanford. And there was a slough that crossed that ranch when they moved in the 40s, and they spent time moving the dirt around, and they kept bumping in and digging these things up. And at one time I used to joke, I said, I had service for 8. And but the thing that I find interesting about these is there's no date on them in terms of when they were made. So how old are these? Were they 100 years old? 500 years old? 2,000 years old? 5,000 years old? And that made me start thinking about, well, how long were the tribes of Central California here? And it came to from my reading was that there has been a continuous human presence in the Central Valley for at least the last 5,000 years. And they lived here. And so what I did was I put together this little presentation as to what happened in the last 5,000 years in the world. Well, we had the Egyptian dynasty started 5,000 years ago. Another 5,000 years ago, the first Great Pyramid was constructed. Iron was discovered 4,000 years ago. The alphabet was starting in 1800 BC. We had the Chinese dynasty starting. Homer wrote the Iliad and Odyssey. The first Olympics was held in 1776 BC. Rome was established 750 BC. The first temple of Jerusalem was built. Paper was invented. Vesuvius erupts. Gunpowder was invented. In 1199, the compass was invented. Magna Carta was signed. 1492, Discovery of America, and then I have in here the 1847 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which we'll discuss in a minute. So this is all a series of history that happened in the last 5,000 years, and at the same time, there were people that lived here. 3000 BC, the Tachi Yokuts ancestors came here, and they lived in this valley with little outside influence for 5,000 years. Now, why is that? How could a Stone Age culture live unmolested for 5,000 years? Now, when I talk about Stone Age culture, I'm not knocking them by how they were. They had no metal. They used stones and sticks and tules and animal hides and asphalt that they found in Kern County, and they used all the natural elements that they were in to live with and construct their tools. They had no metal, no paper, no writing. They had their petroglyphs, which we see some of. And so, again, how could they live here for 5,000 years and nobody mess with them? Well, let's take a look at the geography here. So what we have here is, you see this little red spot, that's where the Santa Rosa Rancheria is, okay? And we have this view of the western hemisphere of the Earth, and up until about the late 1600s, all this was undiscovered country. And when you zoom in closer, you realize that from this point to this point, all you had were mountains, deserts, canyons, more mountains, more deserts, more canyons, more mountains, more deserts, more canyons, and then you had here. So if anybody was going to come across this way, first of all, who would do that? Okay, so from the east side, the Tachis and the Yokuts of the Central Valley had this massive wall of impenetrable deserts and mountains to hide it behind. Then you go on the other side, well, you had 5,000 miles of ocean. There was nothing. I mean, Hawaii didn't even be discovered at this time either when they were here. So this was a vast ocean in which no human presence was at. You come back and look at it again from the south, there was the Baja Peninsula. There was really nothing down there. And from the north, you could see that there was a way in which you could come in this way, but why would you move down here? So what happened was that the Yokuts were in the perfect place to hide from the entire world, the Central Valley. And the Central Valley was the Garden of Eden. It was an unbelievable place to live. And think about where we're at today. Today is what? The 28th of February? How hot is it right now? It's in the 70s. Kind of crazy. But you go east of us and there's people freezing. And so the Tachis and the Yokuts, I keep using Tachis and Yokuts interchange. It's actually the Yokuts. And there were different tribes within the Yokuts, and we'll talk about that. So the Yokuts lived in this wonderful valley. And this is an artistic impression of what the valley looked like in the 1850s if there was a satellite floating around the Earth. And what you have down here is Little Kern Lake. You have Buena Vista Lake. This was the Kern River spillover into Tulare Lake. And this would flow in, this would be the Tule River, the Kauai River, the Kings River. This is the Fresno Slough, which flowed into the San Joaquin River, the Mendota Pool, all the way out to the San Joaquin Delta. This was the largest inland, go back, this was the largest inland water lake west of the Mississippi. And it was an unbelievable paradise. Every every animal, bird, fish, four-legged animal would live around this lake. And so the Tachis, especially, along with the Wachumna and the Chichilla, they lived here. And this was it was a Garden of Eden. And as I said, they lived unmolested for 5,000 years. Now, I show this bird here. What is that? What do you call that?
Mud duck.
It's a mud duck. It's a mud hen. That's right. Well, Tachi is the Yokuts word for mud hen. So the Tachis, which live in Lemoore now, their ancestors were known as the mud hens that lived around Tulare Lake. And so it's kind of funny when you think about it, but that's where they get their name, because this is what they did. This was their environment. They lived on and around that lake. And so what I did here was, I was curious about this, This is a modern map of Kings County. And this is a map that I pulled out of the Tulare Lake Basin book that I showed earlier. And it showed where the 5 different villages were for the Tachis. And they would migrate between the seasons. In the summer they'd live over here, in the winter they'd live over here. And so I was kind of figuring out where this is. Well, Walnut is Kettleman City. Waiau is where the Santa Rosa Rancheria is now. Chi is between Lemoore and somewhere out there by West Hills College. And Golan and Adju is out near Huron. And they would just rotate based upon the seasons. They would live around that area there. They had a pretty simple life. Again, didn't need much insulation. It was pretty warm in the winter. It's hot in the summer, but that's okay. And this is an example from the handbooks of the Yokut Indians of the type of grass huts that they lived under. And it's made out of tules, and everything was made out of the natural woods and fibers that were allowed in the area. And I'm using this picture out of the book because this is one of the few pictures I've been able to find of it. When the Europeans first came into this area, there weren't too many people that really cared about what was going on here archaeologically or historically, so nobody took pictures. There's very few pictures of the tribes that existed here at the time, and they're very difficult to find. The type of clothing that they wore, again, from the handbook of the Yokut Indians, they would wear grass skirts, leather flaps, pretty much, they were known just to run around naked. They didn't have to worry about it. And only on the very, very cold days would they cover up with something. And so, and again, this is an example, this picture was taken in the early 40s, showing what the type of clothing that they would wear. The one thing that they were famous for, and you know that, is the basketry. The Yokut basketry is considered to be the highest form of Stone Age art that ever existed on this planet. Now, how do you figure out how to weave these types of baskets with this type of detail and have the time to do it? Simple. You lived in the Garden of Eden. You did not have to worry about where your next meal was going to come from. You had the lake, the Tulare Lake. Around that lake were freshwater clams, there were turtles, there was fish, there were deer and elk, and they had the Kings River, and you go up in the mountains, you had the acorns and the deer, and then the north part there, you had the elk and the deer and the antelope that ran the plains. There was always plenty of food. And when you have plenty of food, you have time to think about more esoteric things, such as how do I make a basket out of grass? Here's some other examples of some of the basketry that was made, and you can just see the amount of detail that went into this weaving to make sure that these types of imagery would come out. Now, I've learned that whenever there were people in the basket, this was a funeral basket. This was a basket that was left next to the grave of a tribal member to help them with their spirits in the next life. Here's some more basketry, just examples of what was out there in terms of the basketry that they'd done. It's just incredible. It's very valuable. If you acquire, there are people that collect, they spend thousands of dollars for these items, and it is fascinating to see how they were made. They also had stone-tipped arrows that are made out of obsidian, and one thing that I learned in my readings was they had 2 types of arrows. They had hunting arrows, and they had war arrows. And they were made differently. Now, yes, even though they had all the food they want, they still had war. They had other tribes out of the valley that would come in here. And so a hunting arrow was made with obsidian, and what they would do is they would attach it to a stick, and they would tie it up with sinew, and then use melted asphalt to waterproof the sinew so that when the arrow stuck in the animal, the arrow would stay in the animal along with the stick. And then as the animal tried to brush the stick off, it would break off inside the animal, and then they would track the animals that bled to death, and that's how they would kill the deer or any animals with the arrows. With human arrows or war arrows, they were made differently. It was still with the stick, and it was still with the sinew and the stone, but they did not waterproof the sinew. So that when the arrow stuck into the human, the blood would soak into the sinew and cause it to remove itself, the stick from the stone. So when you pulled the stick out, you left the stone inside to fester. It was very cruel, but that was how they did it. And it was really, when you think about it, you're just like, but that was the way it was. So they also used bones to make, to pull sinew through to weave clothing and other types of items. And this is a postcard from my collection. This is the largest collection of California Indian mortars and pedestals in the world. It was in Pacific Grove, California, and you can just see just the amount of stone that was out there. And again, it's kind of sad when you see this, because where did this come from? What happened to those people? Now when you hear about these Native Americans with their casinos, it's not fair, it's not right. Well, it's kind of funny, but gambling was part of their life for thousands of years. They would have this gambling that they would put together, and they would they would take a walnut, they cut it in half, and they'd soak it in asphalt so it'd be solid, and then they would bet, if you throw the 4 walnut halves, how many would go up and how many would go down? Was it odd or even? Was it 1, 2, 3, or 4? And they bet on that. And that was part of their pastime in terms of was their gaming. So that's why they say, hey, gaming's part of our life, we need a casino. I laugh about that, but that's their argument. This is a map that I have for my collection. It's an 1876 map of the Tulare Lake Basin. And what I did was I drew in some lines here so that you could see the rough boundaries of the different tribes of the Yokuts.